I was recently looking through the archives of a public hearing for a major transit project in a Western capital, the kind of meeting where dozens of highly paid consultants spend 4 hours debating whether a new rail line might disturb the emotional well-being of a local park's squirrel population. Everyone in that room seemed genuinely proud. To them, the fact that they had spent 12 years and $3 billion without laying a single mile of track wasn't a failure. It was proof of a robust consultative democracy. They were deeply invested in the process, convinced that as long as every possible objection was filed in triplicate, they were winning. But then I saw a clip from a very different kind of meeting at the border of Singapore and Malaysia. There were no protest placards, no grandstanding politicians, and certainly no lawyers arguing about visual pollution. It was just a group of people in sensible short-sleeved shirts standing on a humid landing pad. They didn't give a speech about the philosophy of movement. They just checked a tablet, and a small white drone carrying a package of urgent medical supplies silently lifted off into the haze over the Malacca Strait. While the Western Committee was still motioning for a coffee break to discuss stakeholder inclusivity, that drone had already cleared international airspace, bypassed the gridlocked causeway, and landed at a hospital in another country. That contrast between a society that has perfected the art of saying no and one that has quietly retained the biological instinct to build is more than just a difference in logistics. It's a glimpse into a massive civilizational pivot. We've been taught that progress is something that happens in parliaments and courtrooms through the triumph of ideas, but standing there, watching that drone disappear into the horizon, you realize that the future isn't being won by the people with the best arguments. It's being won by the people who still remember how to actually move a brick from point A to point B.
That anecdote is, it's just a perfect distillation of the challenge facing global governance today. It's so sharp.
It really is. And that's what we want to get into in this deep dive, right? To unpack that contrast.
Exactly. Our mission here is to unpack that sharp contrast, because it really does suggest a kind of civilizational pivot away from prioritizing, exhaustive process.
The squirrel hearing.
The squirrel hearing, what some analysts call Vetocracy. It's a pivot away from that and toward prioritizing palpable results. That biological instinct to build you mentioned.
So what we're really looking at is a massive divergence in what?
State capacity.
State capacity and the models of governance that enable it, yes.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Because what I'm seeing in our source material is that these East Asian, meritocratic, results-oriented systems, they're just getting things done. They are achieving the rapid deployment of these incredibly complex physical and technological corridors.
They're building quickly and efficiently. And it stands in such stark contrast to the stagnation and the procedural delays that we see so often in many Western liberal democracies. That Singapore-Malaysia drone corridor, it isn't just a cool gadget. It's a statement, isn't it? It's a statement about the comparative advantage of a governance model that is absolutely focused on capacity.
Precisely. And what that highlights is how this kind of meritocratic governance, as you say, is streamlining cross-border technocratic cooperation for these really high-tech infrastructure projects.
So they're bypassing the gridlock.
They are sidestepping these systemic delays, the delays caused by, electoral populism and this procedural gridlock, the Vetocracy, that has just bogged down so many of their Western counterparts.
So the rapid deployment of this stuff, these physical tech corridors, it's actually redefining what it means to be a modern state. It's all about the ability to execute.
It's all about execution.
Yes. So let's start with that hard evidence of execution. The Singapore-Malaysia drone corridor, you mentioned it bypasses a physical bottleneck. For anyone listening who's not familiar, the Johor-Singapore Causeway, it's one of the busiest land crossings on the planet.
It's a nightmare. It is a perpetual gridlock. You have millions of travelers, millions of dollars in freight trying to get across every month.
And it leads to hours-long delays.
Hours. And this is why the drone corridor is so significant. It's a demonstration of state capacity that achieved this incredibly complex cross-border cooperation to overcome a physical infrastructure failure.
So they decided to go over it.
They realized that by using uncrewed aerial vehicles, or UAVs, they could find a high-tech solution to deliver urgent medical supplies that the trucks and cars on the ground simply couldn't handle quickly enough.
It's a leapfrog strategy.
It is, enabled by an agile engineering culture, and this is key, the regulatory alignment between two separate nations.
And the tech itself is just fascinating. But it's not like one single magic drone, is it? We really need to differentiate between the types of UAVs being deployed here. It sounds like a whole complex orchestration.
It absolutely is. I mean, the operational requirements, you're looking at range, payload, how agile it is in a city, and even the noise it makes. All of that dictates the choice of technology.
So what are we talking about?
Well, you can sort of categorize the hardware into three main families. First, you've got the long-haul workhorse, the fixed-wing aircraft.
Okay, so think like a miniature airplane.
Exactly. Like the models from Zipline, the Zip. These things are designed for endurance and speed over long distances. They glide efficiently. They can hit speeds around 50 kilometers an hour, fly for up to 2 hours.
And carry a decent amount of stuff?
A decent payload, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe up to 25 kilograms. That's more than enough for blood, vaccines, specialized medical equipment. And a key thing is they fly at higher altitudes, so they often go completely unnoticed.
Which is huge for noise complaints over populated areas.
And for flying international routes, you don't want to be buzzing just over the treetops.
Okay, so the fixed wing is for getting supplies between cities or countries quickly. But what about navigating, say, downtown Kuala Lumpur or Singapore? That's where you need to be able to just stop and hover.
Exactly. And that's the domain of the multi-rotor UAVs. Think of the popular DJI Phantom series, but, the industrial versions are much, much larger.
The ones that look like big spiders.
The very same. They are the short-distance specialists. They excel in agility and precision in these really dense environments. Their whole defining feature is vertical takeoff and landing, or VTL.
Which is absolutely essential in a city. There are no runways.
Right. But there's a trade-off. The mechanics for VTL and hovering, it's incredibly energy intensive.
So they're louder and have less range?
Much less range. They're noisier, and you're looking at maybe a few miles of range, a flight time of maybe 30 to 40 minutes, carrying lighter payloads, usually between 2 and 5 kilograms.
So you have the long-haul glider and the short-hop helicopter, essentially. And I'm guessing the third type tries to combine the two.
That's where you get the hybrid aircraft. These machines are trying to bridge that gap. They keep that crucial VTOL capability for flexible landings in the city.
Okay.
But then they incorporate aerodynamic features, like rotors that tilt forward or wings that deploy after they take off to get the endurance and speed of a fixed-wing model once they're in the air.
So they take off like a helicopter and fly like a plane.
You've got it. And that gives you a huge increase in range, sometimes up to 100 kilometers per hour, endurance stretching to 3.5 hours, with a moderate payload, maybe around 10 kilograms.
Understanding those trade-offs seems crucial. It's not just let's use drones, it's about a state having the capacity to match the right tool to the specific job.
That's advanced state capacity in a nutshell.
But, all this sophisticated hardware is completely meaningless if your regulatory system prevents it from flying beyond a football field. The real innovation here seems to be in the governance. Specifically, how they navigated the regulatory hurdles around what they call beyond visual line of sight, or BVLOS operations, which is obviously critical for a cross-border flight.
The governance innovation is, I would argue, the most significant piece of the puzzle. Western projects get stuck because their regulators use these old prescriptive models.
What does that mean, prescriptive?
It means they dictate exactly how a machine has to be built and operated, which, with new technology, becomes obsolete almost instantly. The key here is a shift to performance-based regulation, a model that was famously adopted by Rwanda, actually, back in 2018.
Okay, so how does that work differently in practice? What does a performance-based regulator do?
Instead of a regulator demanding that a UAV meet, thousands of specific static design requirements, which can take years to certify, performance-based regulation focuses on the outcome.
On safety.
On demonstrated safety. The approach shortens the certification time by just requiring the operators to demonstrate compliance with safety expectations for each mission type.
So for Zipline, for example.
For a company like Zipline, they have to prove through data and just rigorous testing that their system delivers its payload reliably and safely every single time. They have to show how they manage risks like mid-air failure or collision, regardless of the specific nuts and bolts they use.
So it shifts the burden from avoiding risk through paperwork to managing risk through proven capability.
Perfectly put. And by focusing on demonstrated performance, they just massively accelerated the adoption of UAVs and permitted those complex BVLOS operations that are necessary for this kind of project.
That feels like a really high-stakes trade-off. I can hear the critics arguing that focusing on performance risks sacrificing future safety because you're sidestepping that deep scrutiny of the process.
And that's the tension, right? But the proponents would argue that the traditional prescriptive regulation is so slow that it effectively bans innovation. It just kills it in the cradle.
Whereas this is about managing risk dynamically.
Exactly. It lets regulators set the safety bar incredibly high, demanding near-perfect reliability, especially for things like blood and medicine. But it allows the private sector to innovate quickly on the how. And the result, as you see in this corridor, is speedier implementation while maintaining incredibly high safety standards.
And to operate these fleets, these high-volume fleets, across cities and borders, you need more than just good drones and smart regulations. You need, like, an air traffic control system for the future. I think they call it the UAV urban stack.
Absolutely. For scaled, reliable operations, the hardware and the regulation have to sit on top of a specialized infrastructure layer, this urban stack.
And what's in that stack?
It requires three foundational elements. First, robust connectivity. You need reliable 4G and 5G networks. They're indispensable for real-time command and control, especially for these BVLOS operations where the pilot is miles and miles away.
Okay, so the network is number one.
Number two is precise navigation and addressing systems. Standard GPS isn't always accurate enough for, say, landing on a specific tiny pad on a hospital roof in a city.
Right, you can't be off by a few meters.
Not with medical supplies. So you need highly precise localization, sometimes using ground beacons or advanced sensor fusion to guide the flight paths perfectly.
And the final piece has to be managing the chaos, right? When there are hundreds or thousands of these things flying around at the same time.
That's the uncrewed traffic management system, or UTM. This is the non-traditional air traffic control. It's absolutely crucial for ensuring predictable, safe, and deconflicted air traffic.
So it's handling flight path authorization, tracking, weather.
All of it. Real-time tracking, weather avoidance, managing potential conflicts, especially when one operator might be running multiple aircraft all at once, autonomously.
That sounds like a huge market.
It's projected to be a multi-billion-dollar market segment globally. But interestingly, the sources point out that it's currently the least developed part of the whole UAV industry. It's less than 1% of the market today.
Which makes the working system that Singapore and Malaysia have even more impressive.
So much more impressive. They are proactively building the future, not just adopting the tech.
And it seems Malaysia specifically is really trying to lock in this future capacity on the ground. There's a clear state intention here to master the physical building process.
They are. Malaysia's commitment is tangible. You can see it in the establishment of Area 57.
Area 57?
It's a dedicated drone hub located strategically within Technology Park, Malaysia. And this isn't just an office park. Area 57 is designed to be a national one-stop center.
For what?
Its mission is to support the entire domestic drone development lifecycle, all under one roof. Everything from design and manufacturing to testing, certification, and even post-sales maintenance.
So they're bringing the whole supply chain home.
This centralization, it signals a clear intention to internalize and master the physical building process. It's about moving up the value chain from just being a user of technology to being a global innovator.
Which contrasts so sharply with the deindustrialization and the loss of that kind of manufacturing capacity that we've seen in some older Western economies.
It's a completely different trajectory.
Okay, so we've established the impressive, the engineering, the regulatory agility, but the real question, the one that I keep coming back to, is why? Why are governments willing to pay what is often a premium for that kind of speed? Let's pivot now to the political incentives that are driving this global race, especially when it comes to development finance.
This is a deep dive into political economy. And when we look at the choices around infrastructure finance in the Global South, we often find that the immediate need for speed is prioritized because of just fundamental political survival incentives for the leaders in charge.
Fast delivery is a politician's best friend.
It really is.
And that implies a very specific calculation around what we can call the cost of speed. If a leader chooses a faster option, they're often accepting a higher fiscal cost like higher interest rates in exchange for a political gain. What are the debt mechanics behind that decision?
It's a rational, though you could argue very short-sighted calculation. Incumbent leaders will often choose financing options that guarantee speedy project completion, even if those options carry significantly higher costs than, say, a concessional loan from a multilateral institution.
A loan with lower interest from, like, the World Bank.
Exactly. And the key is that the debt repayment for these high-interest loans is delayed. It's pushed into future periods, often well beyond the current leader's term in office.
So the bill comes due for the next guy.
The incumbent is therefore incentivized to prioritize the immediate, tangible electoral gains they get from speedy, visible infrastructure delivery. A new bridge, a new highway, They know the financial bill will land on their successor's desk.
So the political benefit of cutting that ribbon before an election just completely outweighs the long-term risk to the country's debt.
For that leader, in that moment, yes. And this brings us directly to China's speed advantage versus the typical Western delay.
Right. China's lending model seems to have leveraged this political reality perfectly.
It has. It offers the critical advantage of completing major transformative infrastructure projects within a single electoral cycle.
Which is usually about 5 years.
Typically, yes. The construction is aggressively fast, and that ensures the project is visible and functional to the public very quickly. And, this speed is often facilitated by having fewer environmental and social safeguards compared to Western-backed projects, which simplifies the planning process immensely.
So let's contrast that with the multilateral organizations. You mentioned the World Bank. Why is the World Bank known to be so slow, regardless of the political urgency on the ground?
Well, World Bank projects and those from other multilateral development banks, they're constrained by this whole array of necessary but very time-consuming procedural checks.
The Vetocracy again?
It's a form of it. You have exhaustive environmental impact assessments, extensive anti-corruption audits, mandatory local stakeholder consultations. Each of these can require multiple review cycles that stretch over many, many years.
So the whole process is designed to be deliberative.
Exactly. And that means project implementation takes significantly longer. And critically, the speed of a World Bank project remains slow, regardless of the host country's electoral timing or the political visibility of the project. Their timeline is just fundamentally misaligned with the short-term political incentives of elected leaders.
And the sources for this dive provide specific evidence for this link, right? They almost document a political budget cycle that's tied specifically to Chinese infrastructure loans.
We can document 2 distinct cycles that confirm this behavior. The first is the announcement cycle.
Okay, what's that?
The data shows a really clear peak in the announcement of Chinese financed infrastructure projects early in an incumbent's term.
So 2 or 3 years before the next election.
Typically 2 to 3 years before re-election, yes. And that timing is not accidental. It allows enough lead time for construction to begin and to reach a visible functional stage before voters head back to the polls.
And the second cycle tracks the delivery itself.
That's the completion cycle. The actual completion of these visible infrastructure projects is tightly clustered around the re-election year or the year immediately prior.
So you can cut the ribbon right on time.
It maximizes the incumbent's signaling capacity, the ability to point to a new port or a newly paved highway right before an election. It's just an undeniable signal of competence to the electorate.
And there's another fascinating detail here. This electoral cycle effect is restricted only to financing for visible physical infrastructure.
Yes. Things like ports, railways, and roads. Things that serve as clear, undeniable signals of the incumbent's capability.
So if the loan is for something non-infrastructure like, say, general budget support or trade financing, that electoral cycle doesn't show up in the data.
Exactly. The data shows no corresponding electoral cycle tied to non-infrastructural loans from China. And this is crucial evidence because it strongly suggests that the borrowing government's decision to accept these higher interest rates is fundamentally driven by the electoral incentives tied specifically to visible development outcomes, not just a general need for capital.
The leaders are buying immediate political visibility.
That's what they're paying the premium for.
Let's ground this theory in a concrete example. The Indonesia high-speed rail case study seems to perfectly illustrate this political calculus versus the fiscal one.
It is the canonical example of the cost of speed. In 2015, the Indonesian government held a major tender for its flagship high-speed rail project connecting Jakarta and Bandung.
And there were 2 main competitors, China and Japan.
Right. And Japan offered a concessional loan, a much lower interest rate, around 0.1%, with a longer repayment term. It meant much lower long-term fiscal costs for Indonesia. The financially prudent choice was obvious.
It was Japan.
It was Japan.
And yet, the Indonesian government selected the Chinese proposal.
They did. The Chinese proposal carried a significantly higher interest rate, closer to commercial rates, and arguably a much greater long-term risk for the national budget.
So why?
Primary and secondary reports repeatedly cited one main factor for Indonesia's choice: the speed with which China could implement the project. The Chinese model's speed advantage guaranteed project completion within one political cycle.
So the incumbent administration prioritized the certainty of that rapid delivery, that electoral visibility, over the long-term fiscal benefits of a cheaper but slower loan from Japan.
That's the choice they made.
But doesn't this whole mechanism raise really serious concerns about the long-term stability of the nations involved? I mean, if leaders are consistently prioritizing their re-election over sustainable debt management, that sounds like a recipe for fiscal disaster down the line.
And that is the counter-argument that you have to acknowledge. The potential for debt traps or just unsustainable fiscal burdens.
Right.
While the incumbent leader gets the short-term political benefit, the nation shoulders the risk of accepting these higher-interest commercial loans that often lack the transparency and safeguards of multilateral financing.
And history is full of examples where fast, debt-heavy projects failed to deliver sustainable returns.
Right. It's littered with them. Projects that led to economic instability once that initial political glow wore off.
Yeah.
This competitive aid environment. It really forces politicians to make a very stark choice between their own short-term political survival and the long-term solvency of their nation.
That gives us a really clear framework. Speed wins elections, and certain governance models are built to deliver that speed. But what happens when the ambition is there, but the execution fails? Let's look at Malaysia. It has the geographic proximity, it has the stated ambition of this East Asian capacity model, and yet the sources point to these persistent challenges in implementation.
Malaysia offers a really necessary nuance to this whole story. The country has consistently set clear, high-level strategic goals. The long-term objective, which was encapsulated in policies like Vision 2020 and the new economic model,
Was to escape the middle income trap.
Exactly, to escape that phenomenon where countries get stuck at a certain income level because they can't compete on low costs anymore, but they haven't developed the high-value capacity to compete on innovation.
So Malaysia aimed to transition into a knowledge-based economy driven by science, technology, and innovation, or STI.
That was the plan.
So the ambition is clear. It's backed by massive investments in research institutions, new technology zones. So where does the structural weakness lie?
The structural weakness is consistently identified as the implementation gap. Malaysia is adept. They are excellent at developing these ambitious, comprehensive national strategies. The blueprints are fantastic, but that ambition is routinely undermined by systemic weaknesses. You see excessive bureaucracy, interagency friction, poor monitoring and evaluation of existing projects.
And critically, as the sources note, ill-equipped or unprepared middle management.
Yes, who often lack the operational autonomy to actually execute the strategy effectively. And this often leads to this very reactive policy development where new, exciting announcements are made before the previous initiatives have even been completed or properly assessed.
It sounds almost like a domestic form of Vetocracy, a society that can't say yes to itself, even with clear intentions from the top.
That's a great way to put it.
And we see this so vividly in the failure of the technology corridors. Can we detail that contrast between Malaysia's Bio Valley and Singapore's BioPolis?
The difference is just striking, especially given that they were conceived around the same time in 2003.
Okay, so tell me about Bio Valley.
Malaysia launched the Bio Valley project as a flagship, a $160 million U.S. biotech hub. It was meant to symbolize their national biotechnology ambition to attract international pharmaceutical and research firms.
But it didn't work.
Critics noted the project just failed to cluster activities effectively. They argue that, you need an ecosystem, not just a piece of land. Bio Valley never gained that critical mass. It struggled with talent retention, with regulatory continuity, and eventually it had to be scaled back significantly into the less ambitious BioNexus scheme, which is just built around existing facilities.
And Singapore's equivalent announced the same year the BioPolis.
BioPolis, Singapore's high-tech biomedical park, also launched in 2003. It cost significantly more, $370 million US, but it became an immediate success.
What does that success look like today?
Today, it's a world-renowned biomedical research cluster. It houses over 2,000 scientists and researchers. And crucially, it successfully attracted the global giants. Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, Abbott, they all have a presence there.
So the difference wasn't the ambition, it was the ability to execute.
It was the ability to execute to foster the necessary regulatory and academic ecosystem, and to ensure that clustering effect actually took hold.
And a similar pattern seems to have plagued the Multimedia Supercorridor, or MSC. This was another grand vision that never quite materialized its potential.
The MSC was perhaps the most ambitious structural project of them all. It was envisioned as this island of excellence for multimedia and R&D.
And it was huge, right? Roughly the size of Singapore itself.
With a staggering projected cost of $20 billion over 2 decades, it was meant to catapult the Malaysian economy into the digital age. And while it did successfully attract massive volumes of foreign direct investment from big names like Shell and BMW,
the $4 billion investment aspirations fell short.
They fell short of truly transformative success. That's what the critics contend.
How did it fall short if it was attracting all that FDI?
The problem was the quality of the FDI and the lack of innovation spillover. The MSC often functioned primarily as a generous tax haven.
So it was attracting companies for back office functions and call centers, not high-end R&D.
Exactly. It struggled profoundly to translate that volume of FDI into genuine local innovative capacity. It failed to cultivate homegrown innovation and became too reliant on multinational corporations just for scale, not for technological mastery.
It became a hub for using technology, not creating it.
Precisely. And that leads directly to the human capital challenge. You can't build a knowledge economy without a reliable pipeline of highly skilled, adaptable graduates.
And despite massive investment in education, a rapid expansion of institutions in the 90s and 2000s, the output remains mixed.
It does. While the number of researchers has climbed, the economy faces this persistent shortage of skilled graduates and a real difficulty in cultivating creative and critical thinkers.
There's a key policy decision that illustrates this, isn't there?
A very clear one. In 1996, to rapidly boost the supply of trained engineers, the government shortened the duration of undergraduate engineering degree programs.
And this was opposed by professional bodies like the Institute of Engineers Malaysia.
It was. And the move resulted in the elimination of crucial curriculum time that was dedicated to non-technical skills, things like communication, leadership, and management.
And the practical consequence of cutting those non-technical skills is that new supplementary institutions have to be created to fill that gap, essentially fixing the problem after graduation.
Precisely. You see the need for these post-university finishing schools, like the Penang Skill Development Center. Their whole mission is to teach the foundational communication and management skills that the university system just omitted.
The fact that those institutions are even needed is a huge indicator of the problem.
It's a significant indicator that while students might be technically proficient, they lack the adaptability and the critical thinking skills required for a genuinely innovative economy.
Speaking of human capital and educational priorities, the sources offer a fascinating perspective comparing Singaporean universities to the U.S. Ivy Leagues. It really shines a light on different national priorities.
This comparison just illuminates a key difference in the state's mission when it comes to higher education. The sources indicate that Singaporean universities, specifically institutions like NUS and NTU,
the National University of Singapore and Nanyang Technological University.
Right. They prioritize a fundamental public mission, educating the masses to be economically productive. This is an intentional policy choice driven by their small population. They can't afford to be hyper-selective gatekeepers.
So their high world ranking exists despite a deliberate policy to ease undergraduate admission for domestic students.
Exactly. For local Singaporean students, the bar for undergraduate admission is often severely lowered relative to the institutional prestige. That's a government policy.
Yeah.
They require the universities to accept a significant proportion of the local cohort.
The priority is to produce the workforce.
The priority is to produce the vast majority of Singapore's white-collar and specialized workforce. To meet a high, useful baseline of education for the bulk of their population, rather than strictly focusing on being globally exclusive institutions that only admit the top 1%.
Which contrasts so sharply with the U.S. model, which is all about gatekeeping.
The top U.S. universities are defined by that intense gatekeeping. Admission is incredibly difficult. It's based on holistic criteria, extracurriculars, leadership, research potential, and their world rankings are heavily weighted toward graduate research, which is a mission often entirely separate from the undergraduate experience.
Whereas Singapore's model, like top Chinese universities, prioritizes test scores and academic rigor.
It's a reflection of a national philosophy focused on ensuring maximum skilled output from a limited talent pool. It's about utility, efficiency, and widespread competence, which directly feeds state capacity.
So while Malaysia is struggling with these systemic issues, there are clear successful pockets of applied capacity, places where the building instinct does succeed. This suggests it's a matter of focused execution, not a lack of inherent ability.
That is absolutely true. Malaysia is not uniformly plagued by implementation failure. There are these quiet achievers demonstrating genuine homegrown capability.
Where do we see this?
One major area is indigenous innovation in Islamic banking and financing, which Malaysia really pioneered. It remains a global leader in defining the regulatory framework and the products for this massive, specialized financial sector.
And beyond finance, what about physical industry?
Look at tourism. Through successful national campaigns and service sector expansion, Malaysia transformed itself into a major global destination. By 2009, it was the 9th most popular tourist destination worldwide, generating over 53 billion ringgit in receipts.
That requires massive coordinated capacity.
In infrastructure, hospitality, regulatory alignment, everything. And within the scientific research complex, we see success in these highly focused centers.
For example, the Cancer Research Initiatives Foundation, or CAREF.
CAREF is a great example of applied indigenous innovation. They focus intensely on Asian-specific cancers like oral, mouth, and throat cancers, which are often overlooked by big Western research grants.
And they've had real breakthroughs.
They've successfully identified significant differences between the risk profiles of Malaysian women compared to Caucasian women in breast cancer, using local resources for highly specific, localized health benefits.
The national economy also relies heavily on cash crops, and here, too, we see that focused innovation.
Yes, the Malaysian Palm Oil Board, MXOB, is critical. They spearhead advanced biotechnology and breeding to improve the oil palm crop. They maintain the world's largest oil palm germplasm collection.
And they're even developing novel processes from waste.
They're recovering valuable chemicals from milling waste for the nutraceutical and pharmaceutical industries. They transformed a waste product into profit.
And there's one more example with rubber wood.
The Forest Research Institute Malaysia, FIRGM, they won the Mahathir Science Award for their work in transforming rubber wood, which was once just a waste product that was burned after the tree stopped producing latex, into a billion ringgit furniture export industry.
So these successes show that when the ambition is paired with focused execution and clear political commitment, Malaysia is more than capable of that biological instinct to build.
It proves the capacity is there. It's a matter of unlocking it systemically.
We spent a lot of time on the physical and technological side of capacity. Now let's shift to the underlying political philosophy that facilitates this highly organized state, specifically focusing on the engine of centralized power, where that administrative efficiency becomes paramount.
This takes us to the very foundation of political legitimacy in highly centralized states. For decades, the governance model relied almost entirely on rapid economic expansion.
Performance legitimacy.
Exactly. The Chinese government, for instance, derived its legitimacy primarily from phenomenal GDP growth. The social contract was simple. We deliver sustained growth and mass economic betterment, and in return, you grant political compliance.
But relying solely on performance legitimacy is incredibly risky, isn't it? Especially as that amazing economic growth tailwind starts to slow down because of things like demographics and debt saturation.
It's very risky. Correct. As that high-speed growth inevitably slows, the government recognizes that simply relying on ever-increasing GDP numbers no longer sufficiently stabilizes the foundation of political legitimacy.
So a shift is necessary.
A necessary and conscious shift in the foundational claim of governance is occurring. The pivot is toward legality.
And we absolutely need to dedicate time to clarifying what legality means in this context, because it is a highly formalized system of rules, but it is fundamentally not the Western concept of the rule of law. That nuance is critical.
The distinction is vital. The transition is toward legality, which means the highly formalized, technocratic, and predictable implementation of written rules across the state apparatus. It's about standardization and efficiency.
But it's not the Western rule of law.
It's distinct from the Western rule of law, which implies a legal constraint on government power. The idea that the law is sovereign and applies equally to everyone, including the central party leadership. In this model, the law is an instrument of the party, not its master.
I'm trying to think of an analogy. It's like, the Western rule of law says everyone, including the CEO, must follow the company manual, and the manual itself is hard to change. Whereas this concept of legality is more like using a perfectly written professional instruction manual that the CEO and the board can change at any time without any legal challenge.
That's a perfect analogy. The directive is aimed at all state and party organs below the center. It's a command to wield power according to strict legalistic doctrines. It makes the party more state-like in how it functions.
So it's replacing informal power with formal procedure.
It demands a more professionalized, top-down, and predictable legalistic approach than local actors were used to. And this rhetorical commitment is so immense that it becomes a difficult commitment to reverse, which reinforces predictability across the entire bureaucracy.
What's the public benefit of this system, though? If it lacks that liberal political content, why does this formalized, predictable enforcement enhance legitimacy in the eyes of the public?
Well, this commitment to legality provides tangible benefits, especially for the business environment. When the law is predictable, contracts are enforced reliably, and bureaucratic permits follow established, formalized timelines.
It reduces corruption and transaction costs?
Exactly. And that rigorous, professionalized enforcement creates a veneer of authority and legitimacy. The population observes state actors reliably acting in accordance with written law in their everyday lives. And that force of authoritative habit, it tends to make them perceive the action as legitimate.
Not because the law is necessarily fair or just,
but because the government is organized, professional, and reliable. This really challenges the Western political theory notion that law is insufficient unless it serves liberal ends. Here, its value is in its functionality and its predictability.
That is a profound insight into how governmental authority can be reinforced purely through predictable process. Now, let's look at how this administrative capacity was accelerated and fundamentally expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic was an unexpected and just a massive catalyst for state building. It forced a dramatic downward expansion of the administrative state that the center had only previously been considering.
Why? What did it require?
The need for granular, immediate control over population movement and testing required pushing governmental authority far, far lower than the traditional district-level administration.
Okay, so how was this implemented on the ground? Down to the street level?
We saw an unprecedented delegation of actual law enforcement and administrative powers down to the lowest possible levels, the sub-district and the neighborhood organizations, specifically the JUE, or neighborhood committees.
And before the pandemic, what were these JUE?
Before the pandemic, they were often staffed by local volunteers or semi-retired party members. They were focused on local mediation, basic community services. During the pandemic, they became the frontline, quasi-official enforcers of public health law.
And we have concrete examples of the extent of this power transfer, don't we?
We do. In some major cities, you can see charts detailing this delegation that show a staggering transfer of authority. Out of a total count of, say, 400 law enforcement authorities previously held only by the district level.
Something like 2/3 of them were pushed down.
A full 2/3, something like 270 of them, were delegated down to the sub-districts and neighborhood committees for enforcement. This created an administrative infrastructure capable of fast response and hyper-local execution.
But I remember reading that these local neighborhood committees were often overwhelmed. They were locally unpopular during the strictest lockdown periods.
They were, absolutely. But they were critical for two reasons. First, they provided the necessary manpower for testing and enforcement. But second, they provided the crucial local knowledge.
Knowing the layout of the apartment blocks?
Knowing specific apartment block layouts, how to assess individual risk levels, and executing the human processing of centralized data. The centralized bureaucracy could generate the rules and the data, but you needed that grassroots capacity, the JUE, to translate the central command into human action.
And this brings us to the lasting legacy. Because while the pandemic measures themselves were temporary, the institutional material that was built to enforce them is durable.
That is the strategic implication. The COVID prevention measures could not last forever. But the expansion of local governmental authority was made of more durable institutional material.
So the central government could dismantle the unpopular pandemic controls?
Like the movement restrictions, yes. They could get rid of those without getting rid of the underlying administrative infrastructure that was built to enforce them.
And that infrastructure provides the central government with this permanent fast response control capacity at the grassroots level.
Which can now be repurposed for general urban management, for social stability, or even for the enforcement of these new, highly formalized laws. It's a powerful and permanent legacy of the pandemic state-building efforts.
So the state achieved a fundamental restructuring and a capacity upgrade under the guise of an emergency response. It transitioned its source of political strength from uncertain economic growth to the predictable, formalized authority of legality.
It's a system that is now intent on becoming functionally more state-like in how it uses law to govern its own bureaucracy and extend its control down to the neighborhood level, thereby reinforcing the central authority through efficient, predictable execution.
So let's bring this incredible volume of detail back to our starting point. The choice between debating the emotional well-being of squirrels and launching a medical drone across an international border.
The core finding is clear, I think. The global pivot is underway. Success in the 21st century may increasingly belong to states that prioritize results and can build quickly.
States that can execute major initiatives, whether they're physical technology corridors like the drone launch or massive administrative expansions like the downward delegation of authority we just discussed.
They possess the competitive advantage of results-oriented governance. And you can see it in their speed, their streamlined technocratic cooperation, and in projects being completed in direct relation to political survival.
And this stands in such sharp relief against the political costs and the infrastructure stagnation that results from procedural perfection, from Vetocracy, which we so often see in slower, more deliberative systems. We saw that even countries with really high ambition, like Malaysia, can struggle when that building instinct is undermined by systemic weaknesses in implementation and bureaucracy, while their neighbors thrive on just sharp, focused execution.
And the underlying shift in the governing philosophy, particularly that pivot toward formalized legality, suggests that modern state capacity is about more than just resources or philosophical ideals. It's about the organizational ability to command and coordinate effectively from the center right down to the individual neighborhood. It's about ensuring maximum operational predictability.
It feels like the defining metric of modern statehood is shifting dramatically. It's moving away from purely philosophical or procedural metrics, the triumph of ideas in courtrooms or endless committee meetings, and toward demonstrated practical capacity. The future, it seems, is being won by those who have perfected the infrastructure, both physical and administrative, needed to move that brick from point A to point B rapidly and reliably.